Hi, this is David Miller, and I'm here with number 6 in the series of mini lectures on Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Today we're going to talk about Rosalind's demeans. Last time we ended with Lord Capulet's discussion of the County Paris's demeans. Let's turn back to an earlier moment. It's when we first hear the word demean in the play. Mercutio uses it in Act 2, Scene 1. A moment sandwiched in, you recall, between the banquet, where Romeo and Juliet first meet, and the balcony scene in which they declare their love. Romeo has ditched his friends, who are looking for him. And I said earlier that we would get back to this moment. Call, good Mercutio, nay, I'll conjure too. Romeo, humours, madman, passion, lover, appear thou in the likeness of a sigh. Speak but one rhyme, and I am satisfied. Cry but I me. Pronounce but love and dove. Speak to my gossip Venus one fair word, one nickname for her purblind son and heir, young Abraham Cupid, he that shot so trim when King Cophetua loved the beggar maid. Ah, he heareth not, he stirreth not, he moveth not. The ape is dead, and I must conjure him. I conjure thee by Rosalind's bright eyes, by her high forehead and her scarlet lip, by her fine foot, straight leg, quivering thigh, and the demeans that there adjacent lie, that in thy likeness thou appear to us. Mercutio, playful as ever, decides on the spur of the moment to conjure Romeo out of the surrounding darkness as if he were a magician calling up spirits of the dead. In this mocking conjuration, he summons Romeo not with the names of devils or secret spells, but with stereotypes of romantic love, a sigh, a rhyme, a reference to Venus and Cupid. King Cophetua, that's a contemporary ballad that people would have known about. When these cliches don't work, Mercutio falls back on Rosaline. You remember who she is, right? At the beginning of the play, Romeo is pining for a girl we never see, a girl we tend, indeed, to forget about as quickly as Romeo does once Juliet comes on the scene. But Romeo's friends don't yet know that he's in love with Juliet, so they're still teasing him about Rosaline. So, still playing on common cliches, Mercutio launches into what's called a blazon, a list of the beloved's features, praising each one for its surpassing beauty. If you've ever read Shakespeare's sonnet, My Mistress' Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun, you know he pokes fun more than once at this literary convention. Here, Mercutio converts the blazon into the terms of his conjuration, summoning Romeo to appear in the name of Rosaline's eyes, her forehead, lip, foot, leg, thigh. You see where this is going. Mercutio is a Shakespearean bad boy. He starts out at the top of the body, naming parts associated with the soul and the mind. That would be the eyes, the lips, the forehead. Then he heads south to the foot and starts working his way back up past the leg and the thigh toward a different part of the anatomy. And so we come to demeans. Mercutio, showing off for his male companions and pointedly teasing Romeo, conjures him in the name of Rosaline's quivering thigh and the demeans that there adjacent lie. I suppose you don't really need a dictionary to tell you what Mercutio is referring to here, but you do need a dictionary to figure out why he uses the word demeans. Your text glosses this term as domains, but what does that tell us? Is Mercutio treating Rosalind's sexual anatomy like real estate? 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, with a fine foot and a straight leg, financing available from owner? Well, yes, sort of. But domain isn't just any sort of real estate. Shakespeare is using English the way he always does, with a phenomenal feel for the fine shades of meaning in every word. So, what are the fine shades in this one? We can start with etymology, always a good idea when you're dealing with 16th century literature. Words, too, have their lineages, their family trees, and because educated people studied Latin, they were much more aware of etymology than we are today. They would use words with a very conscious reference to their origins. So, according to our old friend, the Oxford English Dictionary, demesne is descended from the Old French. You see that in the first line? No doubt it came over from Normandy with William the Conqueror. Its family tree shows that it's closely related to ideas of lordship and private or exclusive ownership of property. That's important. Going back to the Latin, we see that it comes from the word for lord, dominus, by way of the possessive form, dominicus, which means belonging to a lord or master. You see where this is going? Mercutio is speaking of the most private part of Rosalind's body as belonging to her lord, Romeo. This is pretty sarcastic. He and the rest of Romeo's friends know perfectly well that while Romeo would dearly love to be lord and master of Rosalind's quivering thigh, he is currently anything but. Underneath the joke, though, notice the assumption that once a man does, in the familiar phrase, possess a woman sexually, her private domain belongs to him, not to her. One valuable feature of OED entries is that they include specific examples to illustrate each shade of meaning. Among the illustrations given for demesne are a couple of literary examples from works by Chaucer that Shakespeare would have known. One of these, from Chaucer's translation of a poem called The Romance of the Rose, second one there, speaks of love as having caught the speaker's thought in his demesne. This is a feudal metaphor. Love is like a lord, and the lover's mind is in his demesne, or demesne, because it's in his possession, under his control. Just as the whole world, in the first example there, is under the lordship of Alexander the Great. So already in Chaucer's time, in the late 1300s, there's a tendency in literature to use this term of ownership and domination as a figure of speech to describe love relations. In another quote from the year 1542, just 50 years before Shakespeare, the English poet Sir Thomas Wyatt tells his mistress that she has his heart in her demesne. Wyatt's metaphor is still very close to Chaucer's. In both, the poet presents himself as a feudal vassal, whether to the god of love, as in Chaucer, or to his mistress, as in Wyatt. Like the convention of the blazon I mentioned earlier, this scenario of the poet as self-abased vassal belongs to a tradition associated with the Italian poet Petrarch, a tradition in which the lover endlessly suffers and complains. By 1590, the Petrarchan scenario was a notorious bag of clichés. As you saw earlier, Romeo enters the play spouting a number of these clichés, calling out to love, for example, as feather of lead, bright smoke, cold fire, sick health, still waking sleep that is not what it is. In the scene we're looking at, back in lines 9 to 10, Mercutio had already teased Romeo about his close connection between immature love and poetic clichés. "Speak but one rhyme," he cries, "and I am satisfied. Pronounce but love and dove." In his use of demesne to describe Rosalind, Mercutio seems to be echoing these poetic associations in a similarly mocking way. Chaucer and Wyatt use the word to mean ownership in the abstract, not the particular thing that is owned. Mercutio and Capulet both use the word in its concrete sense, referring not to abstract ownership, but to tangible property. But Mercutio also turns the conventional metaphor around. Chaucer and Wyatt both saw the male lover as the vassal, but Mercutio casts Romeo in the lordly role and reduces the Petrarchan mistress, Rosaline, to sexual property, as if the blazon were nothing but an inventory. This is Mercutio's way of satirizing not just Romeo, but the whole medieval tradition of worshipful love, that lies behind Romeo's extravagant style of adoration. All this fuss, Mercutio implies, all this talk of souls and stars and cold fire and bright smoke, desolation and despair, it's really just about one thing: Rosaline's thing. It all comes down to hormones. As you see, the OED does explain the difference between using demene to refer to ownership in the abstract or using it to refer to the thing owned. As a concrete noun referring to the thing possessed, the dictionary tells us, demene refers specifically to land possessed or occupied by the owner himself, and not by any of his subordinates. Sure enough, Mercutio is playing with this shade of meaning as well. Rosaline's thing, he is saying, is to be Romeo's exclusive possession. It must not be cultivated by any tenant farmers, but must, in the words of the dictionary, be actually occupied or held in hand by the owner. Mercutio's use of the word demene, then, is clearly and deliberately demeaning. Mercutio elaborates these aspects of his joke in response to Benvolio, who warns that if Romeo does hear the taunting, "Thou wilt anger him." "Nonsense," replies Mercutio. "'Twould anger him to raise a spirit in his mistress' circle of some strange nature, letting it there stand till she had laid it and conjured it down. That were some spite. My invocation is fair and honest. In his mistress' name I conjure only but to raise up him." Obviously, there are a lot of sexual jokes here. Raise and stand and raise up are all things a conjurer does with spirits, but by placing these terms adjacent to Rosaline's quivering thigh, Mercutio makes them refer to an erection. He does much the same thing with the word spirit, which in Elizabethan English was the common term for semen. Remember Shakespeare's Sonnet 129, the expense of spirit and a waste of shame? There are a lot of puns in that line, too. And he does much the same thing with the word circle. Renaissance magicians would draw a circle to work within, as if marking off the boundary of their magic. But Mercutio's wit transforms this into a term for the vagina. It's not hard, then, to figure out what it would mean for Rosaline to lay and conjure down a spirit that had been raised to stand in her circle. Like I said, Mercutio is a bad boy. But here's the real point. At the same time as all these dirty jokes are flying around with the metaphor of conjuring, Mercutio is also elaborating the implications of demene. As long as the lord of the manor, he's saying, is himself in exclusive possession of Rosaline's domain, the only spirit raised within her circle, he has no reason to be angry. His property rights have been respected. Finally, let's notice that when Mercutio speaks of this as the land that lies adjacent to the thigh, he's echoing in very specific terms the notion of a demene as the land adjacent to or attached to the mansion or main house of an estate. The demene, in this sense, is the owner's private park or garden, as opposed to the outlying pastures and meadows. In this sense, the word refers not only to Rosaline's private garden, it also looks forward to the orchard whose walls Romeo has just climbed over. For in the balcony scene, when Romeo comes to declare his love for Juliet, he does so within the private park attached to her father's house. And he comes there as a trespasser who fails to respect the father's rights as the lord of either demene, that of his house or that of his daughter.